ladies on both are gentlemen beyond belief. And then there's
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are very excited today to be here for a work session. Today is January 21st, 2026, and we are here in the Commissioners' Conference Room at the Administrative Services Building for Larimer County. And we have a work session today with our State Forest Service regarding the pine beetle outbreak update. I am Larimer County Commissioner Jody Scheib-McNally, Chair of the Board of County Commissioners, and I welcome you to this very important meeting. I am joined at our conference table by my colleague, Commissioner John Kafalis. Commissioner Stevens is down at the State Capitol today. We're also joined by our Assistant County Manager, Lori Kadrich. Thank you, Lori, for being here. And also, we have our Community Planning Infrastructure Resources Director, Leslie Ellis. And I'm also joined, very proud and very excited to be joined by our Colorado State Forester and Executive Director of the Colorado State Forest Service, Director Matt McCombs, and our state entomologist and just amazing person to listen to. I'm so excited. I've had an entomologist from CSU on my property that said, "Oh, these are good bugs, keep them." So we're glad to have you here, Dr. West. And I learned a lot about good bugs and bad bugs. So today we're going to talk about a little tiny bug. And I'm going to turn this over to Leslie, who will also introduce some other folks. And I hope all you are turning in will really pay attention. There'll be some great information today. Thank you so much.
Okay, and thank you. My introduction will be brief. Welcome to our guests. And I wanted to point out, too, this was originally scheduled for a Community Planning Infrastructure Resources work session in December, and we bumped it to this time, so it's a little unusual for me to be here on a Wednesday afternoon introducing the work session, but this is very much a topic that overlaps with many of the things that we're working on, and we also have in the audience and available if there are questions that come up, but Josh Roberts from OEM, Office of Emergency Management, Dalen Figs from Natural Resources, and Dwayne Penny from Solid Waste. And they are working on various projects such as our woody biomass study and project, and of course, natural resources and other things. So just wanted to point out that that they're here as well, and this is a topic very much of interest to us. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Again, my name is Matt McCombs. I'm the Director of Colorado State Forest Service, and if you live in our fair state, I'm your state forester. And I want to again thank Commissioner Scheib-McNally, Commissioner Kafalis for making time for us for this important topic. We've been raising awareness and creating a lot of opportunities for dialogue around an emerging condition in our forests, in particular in those forests in the low elevation ponderosa forests of the Front Range of Colorado. Good? All right. And I work very closely, in particular, with Commissioner Scheib-McNally and the Forest Health Advisory Council, an advisory body tasked by the governor on forest health issues in watershed health protection across the state. And as we've been in dialogue, in particular, I thought it was important that we come and have some engagement with this community in particular, because Larimer County will be one of those communities that will be impacted, as Dr. West here will shortly describe. And we wanted, well, I guess two things. We are a service and outreach organization of Colorado State University, and we're situated at the Warner College. And so, possession is 9/10. You've got both the state entomologist and the state forester living in your community, so it makes perfect sense for us to come in and spend some time. But we'll be doing this all along the Front Range of Colorado and ensuring that communities are made aware of the condition change that we'll be facing in the coming years, and then to start thinking through ways that we can respond and ways that we can ensure that we can continue to advance the critical mission of managing our forests as infrastructure that provide clean water, opportunities for outdoor recreation, homes for our wild neighbors, and as well as a variety of other resources. And here in this community in particular, you are no stranger to the impacts of wildfire. And so under the right circumstances, we know with the legacy of the Cameron Peak Fire, the High Park Fire, and a variety of other mega fires that have impacted this community, that wind conditions change and the fuel loading that leads to those fires is that process is underway. The best thing we can do is have the best information available and start thinking through how, as not only as a community, as a state, and working with our federal partners at the U.S. Forest Service and elsewhere, how can we respond together? The statements that I consistently make are, I like to phrase things this way: no one sector on its own. All sectors together, we have a fighting chance. So every community, every HOA, every road corridor, everybody that depends, again, on our forest as critical infrastructure has a role to play in responding to this crisis. And I think the first order of business is to get you up to speed, which thankfully, I'm not going to speak very much anymore because I have brought one of our most fantastic and well-regarded employees in the State Forest Service, and his popularity has escalated dramatically, as you can imagine, in the last couple of months. And certainly the engagement we've had with the governor's office, the legislature, and a variety of other bodies has been driven by the expertise that I'm extremely proud of, rooted in Dr. Dan West, our state entomologist. He's going to provide an overview and some characterization of the current of the history, as well as the present, and thinking about the future. And then I'll be able to speak to some of the initiatives that have been underwritten by a recent executive order from Governor Polis, some resources that are being solicited from the legislature, as well as some investments that we'll be making here at the State Forest Service, and then potentially open the dialogue with this community about how we might be able to work together to face down the challenges ahead. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. West.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you for your time. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, and let's talk a little bit about our forest. So I think it's important to recognize how we got to where we are today. And the histogram that you're seeing, or I assume that you're seeing, depicts some aerial detection survey. So the histogram that you're seeing is the result of somebody, myself or other people with our federal partners, sitting in an aircraft, looking out the window and writing little polygons on the earth that show where there's activity. That doesn't mean that every tree on that little acre is affected, but it just means that there's some activity that has occurred there. And you can kind of see what happened, right? Those of us with a little gray hair remember all the way back into the mountain pine beetle epidemic that occurred mostly in high elevation lodgepole pine forests, predominantly on public lands, predominantly, away from most of the people that we see, not necessarily in a lot of the WUI. So that's the histogram that you see from 1996 down to about 2013. And those of us that have been around for a little while remember, right, in 2013, what happened, right? We had these biblical rains that happened along the Front Range. We saw an influx, a huge amount of water, and we started to see a lot of these trees be able to defend themselves. Again, most of that was in lodgepole pine, and it was just starting to transition into ponderosa pine along the Front Range that we see down there in 2011, 2012. If you look at the inset, you can start to see where we're at today. So approximately 80% of our pine forests were affected from 1996 through 2013. If you look at the inset, you can kind of see from 2020, right? We all want to shudder about the pandemic year, but you can see that there was very little activity, a little more than 200 acres statewide, not a lot going on. And then we've kind of been progressively building since then. I don't know if you can see it, but 2025 is still draft year data. We're at about 7,600 acres statewide. The bulk of that is right here along the Front Range. And the difference between this outbreak and the last is this is predominantly in ponderosa pine forest, predominantly in low elevation right along the Front Range. And I'll show you some maps so that you can get a feel for what that looks like. But the reason that we're here in front of you is because there's a potential for a lot more people and a lot more checkerboard ownership to be affected through this outbreak than historically, and a lot more infrastructure. If we zoom out, hopefully you can kind of see this. The grayed area is where mountain pine beetle historically has been. That's 1996 through 2024 here, but the red is what we're seeing is more recent, or the draft data from the last flights that occurred last summer. And then, of course, the dark green that you're seeing in there is ponderosa pine forest, and the light green is lodgepole pine. So the gist of this story is that basically a lot of the lodgepole pine was already affected. Mountain pine beetle really is one that leaves small diameter. I always like to say, listen, they're really smart. They leave something for their grandchildren. They don't attack the small diameter trees. They pretty much go for the larger diameter trees first. And that leaves this residual forest behind. So the most susceptible trees that we see on the landscape are really in that dark green that were pretty much unaffected from our previous outbreaks. If we zoom in a little bit further, this is what it looks like along the Front Range. you can kind of see here we sit in Larimer County, right? We've got little pockets, but looking over the fence to our neighbors to the south in Boulder County, you can kind of see that they're starting to get more activity as well. And then further yet, down into Jefferson and Clear Creek, down through Gilpin, down into Douglas County, El Paso County, and Teller. So you can really see the bulk of why we're here talking today is that the bulk of where we're worried about or where we think that the potential for mountain pine beetle to move to is in these high traffic corridors, areas where there's a lot of life and property. Let's bring it to reality, right? What does this look like on the ground? That's I-70 on the left there. You can kind of see the, obviously high traffic corridor. Anybody who's driven around Evergreen, this is just outside of Evergreen, just outside of El Rancho. And again, this is just what it looked like in September when I took this image. Again, if we look to the north, that's I-70 that's splitting your screen dead in the middle. But again, I'm less worried about the gray trees in the heart of the center of the image. I'm more concerned about that kind of pocket activity or kind of small clumps and groups of trees that are already red. Those are, of course, the beetle source that will turn into our next red trees that we're going to see this upcoming summer. One last image just to think about this into reality, right? And if you look at every red tree that you see on the image right here, I've surveyed a lot of these properties in these areas, and anywhere from 2.5, for every red tree that you see, there's anywhere between 2.5 and 10 green trees that are currently infested that will turn red this upcoming spring. And so not only is this going to affect a lot of ownership, but it will, of course, affect our traffic corridors, all of our infrastructure, egress, ingress, all the things that we kind of worry about. So I think that this is going to only continue as we move forward. Again, if we think about, okay, this is the map of where we're seeing it today, right? Let's think about where we could see it. If we look in the literature and we think about, well, how far do these beetles fly? Where are we likely to see activity? If we think about most of these mountain pine beetle, their typical flight patterns are within a half mile every year, annually. And so if we just project that out and look across the landscape of where is there any kind of ponderosa pine forest and where are we likely to see activity, this is what it looks like, right? And so not only, that doesn't mean that every tree on every acre is going to be affected, but it does mean that there's a high potential. We know that there's a high correlation where there's activity now, there's likely to be activity in the future. And so this is kind of the first phase of where we likely to see it. If we think about also, there is some research out there that shows that mountain pine beetle and other dendroctonus could easily fly up to 1.5 miles. If we just look and see what that looks like, that's darn near the entire Front Range. And so we don't really know a rate of spread at this point. We saw that it's moving about 2,000 acres statewide pretty much every single year for the last 3 years. And so the rate of spread is difficult with a biological pest like this. It's really a challenge. And this year, particularly with the dearth of precipitation that we've received and the high temperatures, the likelihood that we're going to see an increase of activity this upcoming summer is very, very high. It's already baked in right now, right? The trees that were infested this past summer are already green, they're already infested, and there's nothing that we can really do about that except for get them off the landscape and reduce the overall reservoir of beetles that are going to emerge. But again, we've got to think about timing, right? When do these beetles come out? The beetles are seeking new trees in July and August. And so our active window is really early on in the spring, then kind of a pause during that flight period, and then again, pick up activity again in mid-September when all the beetles are done flying, and we can start to identify which trees are affected and where are we going to put our resources. Our U.S. Forest Service counterparts have made a similar map. You can kind of see that they've, focused a little bit more on that southern portion. We sit in Larimer County, which isn't even a part of this map, but nonetheless, you can kind of see they've projected it out to 2030, and you can see that, again, this just corroborates what we've already looked at, just areas of infestation. I've zoomed in just a little bit on Larimer County just to make this a little more pertinent for where we sit today. And you can see that we've got small activity, a little bit of activity just west of Loveland, and then what we would consider to be fairly endemic small pocket activity across the county. If we then, of course, put our, progression map on here and try to figure out, okay, where are we likely to see that activity? This is what that kind of, Christmas tree map looks like. And then if we just take it one step further and kind of figure out, well, if they flew as far as they possibly could, where are we likely to see activity? And again, it's where we would envision, right? In a lot of those areas where there's a lot of ponderosa pine with high density and large diameters. I'll leave it at that, and I've brought some show and tells if anybody would like to see some beetles themselves. I've brought some just for fun, and I'll kind of yield my time now to let Matt talk a little bit about a response from the state and talk a little bit about what we're doing.
So what I'll do is we have questions. We'll wait till the very end, let you guys get the whole presentation done. So that would be okay?
Either way, I'm good with either.
And
Yep.
honestly, we could just have a conversation. If
Yeah.
something's on the top of your mind, get into it, and we'll keep going. I was just going to characterize
Yeah,
some
why
of the
don't you
things.
go ahead and continue, and then we can do the conversation.
Do you want me to unplug, or does it matter? Okay.
We might refer to it later, so we might want to pull them back up. Thanks.
Of course.
Of course, you
Yeah.
bet. One of the first, I just to sort of characterize how things came about. Dan's relationship with the U.S. Forest Service. He essentially serves not just as the state entomologist, but he also provides his technical services to the U.S. Forest Service under agreement. So he's in an airplane every year looking at this the conditions and categorizing that and clarifying it for managers so we can think about what the appropriate response would be. And I'll be completely transparent that I was I will never forget the moment when the data hit the table. When Dan was like, "Hey, you need to see this," and it just the indicators that we could really move beyond these endemic populations, acknowledging that these beetles are a natural part of the ecosystem. They belong here. They play a certain and important role. But when they move past that endemic towards that epidemic level, they can have incredibly impactful. Or it could be extremely impactful across the landscape. And we know this. We experience this in the lodgepole stands in the mountains as Coloradans. If you vacationed or spent time you sort of watched in real time as the conversion occurred. And it was really just essentially a matter of time before this the environment that we're operating in and the beetle populations that existed, that the probabilities were that we could see a similar outbreak in these landscapes. And so when that moment hit, our first responsibility really is to start raising awareness. And we started with the Polis administration as well as some of our key partners, in particular U.S. Forest Service. And the governor, took very seriously this concern and put together a plan on how we could respond. And I'll be a tiny bit cheeky that for me, it was sort of like getting the band back together, right? We have a lot of experts and a lot of folks that were brought to the table that helped us realize our objectives as a state in the lodgepole outbreak, and we're bringing a lot of that capacity to the table. And so what the governor has done his executive order is called to establish a task force made up of a variety of actors across the sort of national government, state government, local government, as well as nonprofits and communities all across the state to think through the objectives to advance not just the urgent real-time responses, but also a long-term strategy. And one of the things when I talk about long-term, I want to hit very, very briefly here, but importantly, is one of the messages I'm trying to deliver as I engage with leaders like our commissioners here today, as well as those in the room, is we need to commit to two things. And the first one is we need to respond aggressively to protect critical infrastructure, to protect life and property. But secondarily, we also need to make a commitment to ourselves that we're never going to allow ourselves to get in this pickle ever again. The lack of disturbance in these landscapes is what created the homogeneous single age, single species stand of trees that essentially stretches from Wyoming all the way to New Mexico. And without different age classes, different species, it's a ready-made, sort of smorgasbord for a beetle population in its ascendance. And we suppress fire super effectively, and we now know that there's costs associated with that in the long run. We've also, to some degree, suppressed management. And so I just want to impart to this body today that as we think about not just the near term and the midterm, but we think about the long term, it's going to be critically important that we think through ways to ensure that these conditions never foment again. So that's just, that's my state forester's message to you, is that we want to respond, and we want to respond thoughtfully and effectively, but we also want to think about what is the long-term relationship as a people with our forests, and we need to move very rapidly to thinking about our forests as infrastructure. Everybody's calling me. And so the second thing I wanted to just describe is some of the objectives of this task force, and I've got some bullets here. First of all, we want to improve cross-jurisdictional collaboration so we can bring innovation and multiple solutions that a cross-sector approach will take. We're going to develop public education tools for both homeowners and communities, evaluate strategies to protect watersheds and utility infrastructure, be thoughtful about conserving the outdoor recreation and tourism economy and the infrastructure that our communities rely on for their quality of life. Another really important component is advancing our capacity for reforestation and acknowledging that these landscapes may not recover on their own, in particular if they're impacted not just by insects but by fire as well. We want to increase our ability for wildfire detection, suppression, and recovery. As these fuel conditions degrade and fire potential increases, our ability to suppress fire effectively, while we're consistently also trying to achieve our management objectives, is going to be critical to protecting life and safety. Another critical piece is assessing what opportunities we have to incentivize utilization capacity, right? Anytime we have somewhere to take this material, much of it low value, for some level of economic purpose or some form of utilization, we lower the cost per acre of treatment, which benefits all of us. And then what we'll be talking about tonight at our event in Estes Park later with Commissioner Conway, exploring insurance strategies and acknowledging that the increased fire risk is likely going to populate itself into the actuarial models that define how much it costs for us to cover our homes. And so these are things we need to be thinking about now. And then the last, and I would say probably the most important component of the task force work, will be thinking through new funding strategies and implementing, relevant wildfire policies that span not just local but statewide and federal as well, because there is no simple solution that would essentially be low cost. There will be some sunk costs as it relates to how we respond, but the offsets are significant. In fact, recently, Madeline McDonald, who is a watershed scientist at Denver Water, just recently testified before Congress on the Fix Our Forests Act. I happened to watch that hearing, and she used a most recent study that talked about a 7-to-1 benefit as it relates to proactive mitigation and treatment versus reactive recovery and suppression as it relates to wildfire in particular. And so that 7-to-1 offset, it's hard to qualify that for people, but I think that the benefits of acting swiftly and comprehensively, hopefully in really a short amount of time, we'll start seeing those benefits and the investments and the joint action and the collaborative governance that we're going to need to solve this problem will start showing real, tangible, impactful benefits for not just governments, but more importantly, the constituents that they serve. So that task force will be, I think, consolidated here right quick. Those recommendations are, I think, on their way to the governor as we speak. That once it's announced, we'll be getting our work under the guidance and stewardship of staff at the DNR at the state of Colorado, and starting those meetings, I believe, as early as March 1st. So we're going to get to it with delivery, as rapidly as we possibly can. And the due date, I believe, is in June with those initial recommendations. And I have just been requested to step away from the mic here. I need to make a quick phone call, and I'll be right back.
Well, while we're doing that, Director McCombs, thank you for that. Dr. West, we pepper you with some questions. Of course. And if you don't mind, Commissioner Kafals, because I've heard Dr. West speak several times, there's a couple things I'd like to maybe have you just expand on a little bit before Commissioner Kafals' questions. Can you explain to folks how one little grain of rice beetle, the mortality on the tree, and how quickly? And also, can you share a little bit about folks, when we call them hot logs, people might be cutting down and trying to sell the logs to others as firewood or something, and how that could spread. Could you talk about those two things, please?
Yeah, sure. So thinking from the beetle standpoint, They're an obligate beetle, which just means they have to find a new green tree every single year. And the way that it works is with mountain pine beetle, females are the risk takers, probably like us too, but nonetheless, males are basically useless. And ultimately what happens is a female finds a new tree, she's keyed in on the tree resources that says this is a weakened tree. They mate. The male just kind of hangs out at the entrance after they've mated and makes sure that no other beetles go up into her gallery and basically eat her babies. And that process is relatively quick. Within a couple of weeks, she's already made her gallery. Each female can lay anywhere between 50 and 100 eggs. And so, you can imagine what can happen relatively quickly. In a 1 square foot area, you can get multiple attacks. And so you think back to middle school of the kind of exponential growth that can happen. But ultimately what happens, and there's some, a pathologist will tell you that it's the fungi that they're bringing in. An entomologist will tell you that it's the beetles chewing through the phloem. But nonetheless, between that interplay between the beetles and the tree may not know it. If there's not enough water and resin, ultimately what happens is the beetles win. Bark beetles develop until it's the middle of the winter. Then they just kind of hang out all winter until they build up what's called glycerols. That's less important to name, but basically, if you're a car guy, that's just an antifreeze that you put in your, in your radiator. But nonetheless, they build up these antifreezes so that they can make it through the winter. And then in the summer months, they then start to synthesize those and get bigger, and fly to new trees. So you got about 1 year until the tree, from the time that a tree is infested until it's just basically completely red. It severs the nutrient movement and the water movement of that tree. And so without significant above average or average precipitation, and trees are not just sitting ducks, right? Trees use that water, they turn it into resin, and then they are able to flush that wound. Let's say a female bark beetle is trying to get into that bark. The tree is trying to flush that wound out, and that's why you might see some resin around each entrance point. But nonetheless, the tree then is dead whether it knows it or not. It might still, show green, but ultimately, within a year's time, the tree is completely red. And what we're seeing with this dearth of precipitation now is that already, right now, here we sit in January, we're seeing trees that are starting to turn an off greenish color that were infested this past July and August. So it's rapidly, progressing with this lack of precipitation. I hope that answers your question, and I hope it's not too scientific. The last question that you have is around hot logs and kind of infested logs and what do we do with it? And I wish I would have put it in here, but we've developed a map for the 9 counties that are largely within this outbreak. And what we've tried to do is identify where places will accept hot logs. And that's kind of the bottleneck right now, right? Is that once you identify, okay, I've got some trees, what do I do, right? Some people will want to remove the wood. Some people will want to stack it up and leave it for firewood. And that's the education piece, is really trying to figure out where do we take it and responsibly how do we deal with it. Larimer County sits a little bit better than some because, there are a couple of yards that are in town and nearby that will accept wood. But just know that we're building some tools that will help residents identify, okay, this is where I could take some material. And then we want to make sure that we're responsibly treating that material, right? And we want to make sure that people are not showing up to those sort yards and taking that wood for firewood. There's a lot of firewood cutters that are like, oh, this is an easy place to get wood, and then they're just moving the beetles around. So the responsible, kind of piece of it is really making sure that we're treating the wood as best we can. And not only that, but locking up as much carbon as we possibly can, right? We don't want to contribute to any of these kind of more carbon, sources as opposed to sinks. So I'll leave it at that.
I apologize. It is legislative session, and there was a relatively critical request for my approval, and it is over with, and I could re-engage here.
No, thank you, Dr. Weston. Thank you, Director McCombs. And I wanted to start off with those 2 questions, and now I'll ask Commissioner Falls, do you have any questions, sir? Or comments?
Or thoughts?
Good jokes, anything at this point, right?
I certainly have a few jokes, but I'll save those for offline.
Very well.
I have a variety of jokes, but questions, comments, but I'll just focus on this for now because it seems like everything's getting covered here. I'll be in Red Feather Lakes tomorrow. What should I be telling folks up there?
Well, I'll just kind of, I don't want to cut you off.
No, go for it.
I'll just reiterate what people are telling me all along the Front Range. One, how do I prepare? How do I know when it's time to do something? And then lastly, what do I do once I know I've got it? And so the first one is really just identifying, not just based on the maps, but also just the eye test, right? Am I seeing dead and red trees? Many of us that live in the forested ecosystems know, hey, I'm seeing red trees, there's an issue. And many of those folks have lived through the last outbreak, right? That was just starting to move through Red Feather Lakes area. And so one is first trying to figure out, okay, is it in my area? Two, what do I do, right? There's a bunch of tools in the toolbox to try to figure out, okay, and scale matters with this, right? And not only that, but kind of uses. So, we have preventive sprays that are, you can use for small, acreage, or perhaps your favorite relic tree, or perhaps your monumental trees that you see. We have some semiochemicals. That's just a fancy term for basically using the chemistry of the bark beetles against themselves. They communicate to say, this is a good tree. We've figured out when that tree is getting full, they have a chemical signal that says, oh, you got to go somewhere else. You can purchase that product and you can put it out onto your forest. It's also not the silver bullet, just like spraying your trees is not the silver bullet. You're not going to spray your way out of it. You're not going to put these things up there to get your way out of it. It just buys you a little bit of time so that you can do the management on your window. And then lastly, right, trying to figure out a management plan. What do I look like right now before the beetles show up is really critical. In trying to set my forest up so that I have some resiliency, both in age class and species diversity, so that I can try to build in. It's just like your portfolio, right? You're not going to buy all of Starbucks. You're like, let me try to diversify it as much as I can.
Is there a CSU extension or fact sheet that someone like me could carry around? And also, if you think there's added value, would you or one of you consider coming up the next time I'm up there in March? That would be.
No, thank you, Commissioner Cavalis. That's the exact right. So livewildfireready.org. Livewildfireready.org is our emerging one-stop shop for forest health and watershed health protection information. And there's a big red banner at the top of that website. It will draw you to the Colorado State Forest Service fact sheet or a website that'll give you all the information that Dr. West just shared and help individual parcel owners orient themselves to how they can respond in real time. And then I would also encourage you to encourage them to think and act as a community. If one individual parcel owner takes action, but the adjacent community member does not, then essentially you're just moving potentially those insects from one lot to the next. And so community-based sort of thinking this through and as much as possible acting together is really the most effective mechanism. And we know that from wildfire mitigation. In fact, Red Feather Lakes is probably one of the shining stars of how to take seriously the threat of wildfire and to take comprehensive mitigation activities. They've been the benefactor of substantial influxes of resources, and we're working hand in glove with them to implement those projects in real time. And then to your last question, absolutely. We would be happy to show up at that next HOA meeting or next community meeting. It may not be Dan or I. It might be one of our local foresters from the Fort Collins field office, because we're ensuring that all of those individuals all across the state, our 18 field offices across the state, are getting this information and are ready to be sort of the evangelist for all of the ways that community members can get themselves ready for what's coming.
May I ask one more? Well, I presume one of the things I was going to update folks on is this, and I would presume that with the county's community mitigation grant program, that these kinds of activities would, if they meet all the criteria, would likely be a way to get resources to do community-wide work. So I don't believe that's a question. I guess my other question would be, what role? Well, you mentioned lower precipitation. I thought that the mountain pine beetle, when we had the pandemic of that had, all those beetles had headed to Kansas or something like that, and higher elevations, lodgepole pine. So what role does climate change have in all this? And Dan or Dr. West, you mentioned less precipitation and all that. And then I think, Matt, you talked about higher density ponderosa forest, but I thought we're trying to do a better job of reducing that density and creating the proper ecosystem that existed here a long time ago. So there's a couple in there. I guess I cheated. I'm sorry.
I'll just touch on the temperature precip piece. So it's really hard to be a tree in Colorado, right? So as it gets warmer and warmer, like, it's been in the 60s or whatever, those trees are still transpiring, right? Which just is a fancy term for basically they have to exchange gases. Every time they open up those stomates or their kind of valve, water is escaping. Our snowpack isn't around as long as it used to be, and that's a challenge as well. And then you think about trees are defending themselves with water. There's just a full stop. The water is less impactful for the beetles. They're going to get plenty of water through the tree. What really is the impactful piece is trees are not able to defend themselves against attack because they're putting all of their resources into photosynthesis, transpiring. And so as that water is going through their system, they just don't quite have enough resources to build up their defenses, and it makes it really easy for bark beetles to just then attack those trees, if that answers that question.
It does, and my undergraduate degree from CSU, before some of you were born, is a botany degree, so I have some understanding of the terminology that you're using, so thank you.
Yeah, of course. And then, Matt, do you want to touch on the other, I guess the last part of your, yeah.
No, please, whoever. And
Well, you take
then I
first
guess
stab,
I'm
you get some
done.
thoughts?
I'm probably done.
Well, not really. I mean, the climate change piece is really big, right? I mean, we're not the only ones. Colorado isn't the only ones that are dealing with all this climate change piece. And so, of course, it's just basically up and down, not just Colorado, but Wyoming and New Mexico.
Yeah, we're,
Density piece.
yeah, so
Yeah.
on the density piece, like, again, in the absence of those disturbance regimes that would have sort of over time culled out and thinned out, the competition, we all understand when there's a lot more of us trying to get a seat at the table, it's harder to get a seat at the table. And so what we would have normally seen with all those natural disturbance regimes in play is a reduction in density and a diversity in age class and a diversity of species. And with that, when a mountain pine beetle comes in that doesn't eat everything, right? It's specialized in pinus species. It won't eat everything, and so you have these residual forests that can over time continue to establish, reestablish, convert, and sort of move through it takes at times hundreds of years, but to move through those transitionary periods that allows those populations to remain endemic as opposed to epidemic level, and that's where in the absence of natural disturbance, we certainly as a people in Colorado, certainly as residents of Larimer County, we have to find more effective ways to become what I like to term a moral disturbance regimes unto ourselves. If we don't have the ability to either manage for fire or apply fire in ways that are satisfactory to the public or safe to do, then we've got to find an alternative mechanism by which to nature likes to get poked. It's a reactive entity. And we've got to find those mechanisms by which we create that renewal that ultimately becomes resilience. And that's where we're missing the boat. And that's where, again, I want to encourage every community to think about what it is that they can bring to the table, not just through activating their constituents, but activating their resources. Because as we start to stack these resources on top of each other, we get to the aggregate impact that is necessary to start managing our forests as infrastructure, and to do so not just specific for human needs, but as we pursue human needs, we're often pursuing the needs of all species and entities that have a dependent relationship on the forests themselves. But it takes courage and it takes adaptation. Because let's just everyone, I'll just say this, like, I say it this way, that I have a dream that someday the Lorax and Smokey Bear will be in the same commercial. And Lorax says to Smokey, it's okay to cut some trees some of the time. And that Lorax turns to Smokey and says, it's okay to let some fires burn some of the time. And that's that tension. It's the tension between action and restraint where we find ourselves. And what I would offer to you is that the change condition that we're experiencing demands action, and it will demand investment, and it will demand working together in ways perhaps we are not familiar with in the moment in which we find ourselves. And at the agency, our responsibility is to achieve stewardship for present and future generations of Colorado's forests. We don't care who owns it. We don't care who pays for it. We don't care. What we care about is that that we are activated and we are in motion and in response, because the alternative is megafire. The alternative is a degraded fuel condition and a fuel loading equal to what we saw with the lodgepole. And that alternative, as we learned in 2020 together, is inhospitable to our values and the needs of the people that we serve. And so I challenge us all to think through how we can start moving forward together. And I very much appreciate the county's involvement through emergency management, through natural resources, through your ambitions around zero waste, that like all of these things are interdependent. And if we can find ways to come in together as a community of actors, we might surprise ourselves with our ability to respond and ensure that we leave things better than we found them, which is fundamentally my goal in the work I do every day.
You must have a little bit of preacher in your blood.
My father was an evangelist. I'm always trying to get you to the altar, but that's I mean, it's funny to say that because you're not the first, but it is because I feel deeply passionate about our ability. And I'm a little hoarse because I screamed my guts out at Mile High on Saturday, so it's coming off a little smoky today.
I think we should add too, though, that the density piece is, this is a completely different beast than what we've seen in the past, because this is really in that lower elevation ponderosa pine forests. The previous ones were in these higher elevation lodgepole pine forests that were less inhabited. There's just less WUI or wildland urban interface there. And so the density piece is a challenge, right? To string together large tracts that we can actually, make a difference on and that we can thin ahead of it and be proactive. That is the challenge. A lot of people who own these properties are like, hey, I like the screen. I don't want to see my neighbors. I have different values for my property, right, than what maybe we might want for wildfire resistance and everything else. So, yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow. I know enough to be dangerous with questions. I really want to thank you both for being here. I have been with you in Jefferson County for the press conference. I've been with you in the working group, and we've had these conversations for a few months now. You've heard me say, the cavalry's not coming. We are the cavalry. We've got to save ourselves. So we already had a wildfire risk, high risk, and we already had an urgent need to respond to the scale and scope of this problem, of a century or a legacy of a different management style that's led us to this moment. And when you say we don't get in this pickle again, there are a lot of lessons learned for us to go forward. And so could you both share the long-term investment as a community, as a region, as a state? When I'm thinking about the 30-year vision that we just finished as the Colorado Forest Health Council, I take that feel very honored to be there and work on that. The scale and scope and the long-term investment that we need to think about, because there is no federal funding, there is no state funding, there's a lot of need, and this is, no one else is going to be able to do this. Like you had said at the beginning, it's all hands on deck, everyone needs to rise to the occasion. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure, Commissioner. No, and again, I have to just be very clear with Larimer County residents that, the experience that the board brings is significant, but in particular, we really appreciated the local community voice that you've been able to provide in all the different settings as we try to think through this issue. But I would say that, it was asked of me to qualify what the total investment would be in order to achieve the level of resilience and resistance to fire in the out years. And if you look at our forest action plan, we have some, not totally cursory, but but it's preliminary math. It's somewhere between on the order of 200 million per year for the next 30 years to achieve stewardship of just 10% of our most imperiled watersheds and wildland urban interface areas in the state. So if you think about the level and the nature of that investment, it's significant. But then if you know how I referenced earlier, that 7-to-1 ratio, and then it was some insurance industry reports I saw about a year and a half ago, was 13-to-1 in certain instances. And if you look at California and the experiences they've had in some of these communities, we are not dissimilar in the fuel condition and the change condition that we're experiencing. And that means that for every dollar that we invest, even at those significant amounts, acknowledging there's so many other competing demands for our resources right now, the ability to reduce smoke, which has, the difference between a little bit of smoke and a lot of smoke is significant. We have great data on how impactful it is. The impact on the recreation economy, the impact on the people's property values and the cost of maintaining their mortgages as it relates to insurance. If you think about then, of course, the incredible value that comes with a reliable water supply that is 100% dependent on forests for their long-term productivity. We could be confident, even at that scale of investment, which again, if you think, an example would be Boulder County's bringing around $11 million per year through their initiative. You stack that on top of the roughly $10.5 million we bring from the state through grant making, and then another 10 or 15 from the feds. You start to see that, like in aggregate, we could start to approach some of those numbers that I described. And the other thing is, as we activate and incentivize and grow utilization capacity, we start to drive down the cost per acre. And then our ability to impact increases even potentially as our resources stay static. And so all of those things are working to our favor. But bringing the reality of the potential impact that would be equal to inaction, I think is the first step, and we're trying to categorize that for people as we speak. And then we're going to just have to experience the delta as we sort of get this engine started. And my dream, right, my 30-year vision is that we don't stop in 30 years. We just keep in a routine, consistent, science-based, morally rational engagement with the landscape, such that we can continue to depend on our forests as infrastructure the exact same way that we depend on our wastewater systems, and as we tend on all of the other public services that our communities depend on to maintain their quality of life and their pride in their community. So that's where we need to go as Coloradans, and certainly that's where we need to go as Larimer County residents, and myself included.
Thank you. I don't know who wants to take this question. We talked about the beetles, and you showed quite a few other beetles, but there is more biodiversity on the landscape that, as we know, even put aside the pine beetle outbreak, but with just the density and the management currently has maybe stifled some biodiversity. We hear stories all the time, especially from our Department of Natural Resources, about mitigation work, and then these species or biodiversity of plants or animals have returned to the forest floor because of the work. And my question is, maybe expand on that a little bit, but also if we may not see this in my lifetime as I'm getting grayer and all those things, that pine beetle will get back to, as you mentioned, is potential could get back to that endemic and not this outbreak as we have. Is that something that also would be a benefit? We talked about water and snowpack and all these things, but also the wildlife and the plants and the other species that had such a important integrated relationship that has been disrupted as well. So I'm curious about that.
I guess I'll just kind of start. Thanks for that question. I'll just say that our forests have evolved for millennia with these bark beetles. And we're in this scenario, and we've been in this scenario for the last few decades because we're out of balance, like you've mentioned. And part of that out of balance is past management practices, just to put it straightforward. And, of course, this changing climate that we're in now. Our variability in temperature and precipitation is truly a factor of our trees, and our trees can't defend themselves as they used to. But thinking about, the role of bark beetles in our ecosystems, they are the sanitizers of our forest. They are the ones that would typically come through and, the trees that are lightning struck or that might have, other diseases and or maladies. Typically, bark beetles are the ones that are cleaning those up. We are out of balance because of the prolonged windows that we are now in, where we have this vast amount of forest that's often all in these susceptible diameters, age classes, very large old forests that are growing quite dense. And part of it is that, in Colorado, a lot of our resources are around recreation and the water and the air that we breathe and less around timber production. But adding in resiliency, adding in age and species diversity are both key. And doing that proactively ahead of these outbreaks is really what's key. It's not about chasing the red trees. Those trees are already dead. It's really about thinking about where can we put the biggest bang for our buck, and where can we think about where are they heading and where can we start to do some work to really affect the future forests.
Yeah, I think, beyond that is really preparing ourselves for the changed condition. Not just the dying trees and the red forest, but also, a lot of people will struggle with management. Even I still feel a little bit of a twinge, and that's someone who is in the business of ensuring that forestry is practiced all across Colorado. And so it's getting ready for that transition, and then promising yourself that you won't just come to a place that experienced management. Maybe it was a timber sale, maybe it's just a fuels reduction project, whatever it is, but you make sure you come back the next year, and you come back the next year, and you come back, and you find a path of renewal that demonstrates that these choices, these hard choices we make, actually pay enormous dividends in the long run. And if we stay in a monitoring relationship with those activities, we get the critical feedback loop that allows us to adapt our practices with learning. Because I could tell you, we are, sustainability is an incredibly important goal, but in my mind, in the era of climate change, it is also adaptation is almost the equal goal, because adaptation may become the evolution of sustainability as the bounds of what we're trying to sort of keep things in start to shift in real time. And so we've got to get real comfortable taking action and then learning from those actions, augmenting our approach to be even more efficient or effective in the next round. And then acknowledge also that we might not always get it right. And that's the nature of being in a highly adaptive environment that we're going to be in certainly as a people, as a species, for many, many years to come. My hope is that we take that on, again, not with fear, but with reverence and humility and a bias for action.
Awesome. One last question for me. You and we've, as our work on the Forest Health Council of the State of Colorado, we've had a lot of conversations, and I'm really glad you brought up reforestation, because I try to do that every year. I think I'm over the last 4 years of over 500 trees or something. I really love that. I'm trying to make sure I plan my some of my conferences around the planting days this year, so that's how serious I take that. And I know, as a Forest Health Council, I was hoping Director McCombs, you could share the scale and scope of reforestation and what we had before this was going to be met by an investment from the state of Colorado from years ago, and the Forest Health Council really advocated for that. I'm really proud of that. I can't wait to come see it. And we were at the groundbreaking, but can you share a little bit about the capacity in the new nursery, or not new, the renovated, or
New.
It's pretty new.
We took it down to the ground.
I know, it's pretty new. And share a little bit, because that's just down the street here, and something I'm really proud. You talk about Larimer County being the epicenter of forestry and science and expertise in forest management. I mean, we are very fortunate to have all this here. Not many counties have all this expertise and resources here. Not resources, folks who can be helpful, and then having the nursery. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, again, possession is 9/10, and this community has possession of some of the most important scientists, research institutions, and capacity anywhere in the Intermountain West. And one of the soon-to-be bright and shining jewels in that crown will be a brand new, fully revitalized and modernized state nursery at the Foothills campus at CSU, where our offices, state offices, are located. With the Forest Health Council support, as well as a variety of entities. I mean, think of this way: we got $5 million in 2 different legislative sessions. neither of which were in the governor's budget. So it took, and then this was a will of the people project. And then we were able to garner another $5.2 million investment from the U.S. Forest Service. And prior to that, we had the capacity of somewhere between 500 to 600,000 seedlings per year. We're going to be able to produce anywhere from 2 to 3 million going forward when this project is completed in June. And it's just right on time because we expect with both the impacts from insects and fire, we'll have a lot of places where that natural recovery just doesn't occur. That natural regeneration of those future forests doesn't occur, and we'll have the skills, we'll have the material, and we'll have the research feedback loop to ensure that, Larimer County in Colorado becomes an epicenter of reforestation policy good grief. Lead session. An epicenter of that policy and implementation here, not just for the state, but for the interior West. And so we are actually, in just another added bonus, we're in real-time conversations about opening up a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service to garner some of the Replant Act funds to implement the national reforestation strategy, not just on private and state lands, but on federal lands as well, acknowledging that there's an inordinate amount of reforestation and recovery that needs to occur in the wake of the Cameron Peak and East Trouble from fires and the Hyde Park fire as well. So I'm really excited that those investments were made. I can't wait to share that with all of you. We're hoping to have a relatively robust celebration come June, and we hope you all show up. Our commissioners have already been there and seen it at the facility, and I'm just thrilled that we'll have everything that we need to respond to this issue as it relates to reforestation here at the State Forest Service here in Colorado.
Thank you both. I want to see if Lori had any questions. And then Commissioner Falls, if you'd like, make a closing comment and we'll wrap this up. It's been very informative. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I don't have any questions. I do want to extend my thanks and appreciation for your time today and wish you well at the community meeting tonight. I bet you're going to be a hit.
Leslie or staff, did you have any pertinent questions? Okay. All right, Commissioner Falls, did you want to make any closing comment?
Thank you. Well, just to express my gratitude for the work, and I found this to be very interesting. So just thank you very much, and I think Matt knows this. Anytime you can get me in the forest, I would appreciate it. I need to get out there more. Thank you.
Thank you both for being here. Legislative session, I know you're in your high demand right now because it's a big hot topic. And Dr. West, I know you're around doing lots of presentations. I've been in several meetings. I've gotten to see you more in the last 6 months. It's great than I have probably in 4 years, which is great. But also I know there's a lot happening, and I know there's a lot of landowners and folks who have really benefited from your expertise and your energy. And Director McCombs, thank you for your partnership and helping me expand and deepen my understanding, because this is a really big passion area of mine and something I'm hoping that we can get ahead of and join some of those other counties have been really forward-thinking, and hope we can join them and get ahead of this as well, because I'm worried that I see that map. I would love to get those maps, because I always keep saying they cut us off right above there. And I am concerned about this. I have a column already for my next turn in March. I've already sent one out. I should show you so I make sure I'm accurate, but I think I'm pretty accurate, that I sent out to my big, long email list. So I'm want to help with you all. As you know, we're at the Forest Health Council, help you all try to help folks understand. So if they wanted to go, they just go to the website, Live Wildfire Ready, and information and contacts and things are all there. So thank you all for being here today. Appreciate your time. And did you want to say more?
Oh, no, I thought you were.
I just, if it's possible, I'd like to get this slide presentation.
Absolutely.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This afternoon, so I could print up a couple of pages to bring with me tomorrow so I can sound halfway intelligent about what you just shared.
No problem. I'll send it to you as soon as I get back to the
You
office.
bet. Well, Commissioner Sadek McNally, Commissioner Cavalas, and staff, and we really appreciate the opportunity. This is our first one-on-one with the county, and we look forward to doing that all up and down the Front Range. But so thank you for letting us try out our message here first. And again, I just want to thank Commissioner Sadek McNally for her continued partnership and leadership of the council. Commissioner Cavalas, I will make a commitment to you that we will get out in the woods sooner than later.
Yep. Thanks for your time.
Thank
There will
you.
be more coming. I've been working on some data crunching on forests in Larimer County as well as others, and so we'll be engaged here soon, and plus working on some maps with hot log locations. So, yeah, this is just the beginning. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, I think it's a good message. It's just the beginning, and there's hope, and when we're working together, we can do what we can to tackle this. So thank you all. All right, staff, thank you for being here today. I hope you found it as informative as well. Thank you, Lori. We wish you all the best. We know we need you guys out there helping us tackle all this, and I look forward to hearing how other counties respond, and I know we'll be in some other meetings soon. But thank you all, and at 2:30 we are adjourned. I wish you all will have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining us today.
Yep.
Have a good day.
Thank you.